Hello everyone, my name is Tsuki, and today I want to talk about one of my favorite side stories in Final Fantasy XIV, and that is the tale and tragedy surrounding Edda Pureheart. Edda is a conjurer with whom you can first encounter outside the entrance to Sastasha, the first playable dungeon in the game. She is seen panting and surrounded by her party, and upon interacting with them, you can begin to see a faint and unpleasant picture forming. Edda was sent back into town to purchase potions, and is ridiculed upon returning with only 2 potions, with the money she had received from Avir, the gladiator and leader of the group. Both Avir and Leavin, the Elezen archer of the group, complain about how slow Edda was, whilst Pyoreo, the Lalafell Thaumaturge, seems mostly interested in how easy the job venturing into Sastasha should be. However, Avir seems to be somewhat blinded by the possible glory and riches to be obtained by adventuring and taking on the big jobs, as he says, and complains about Edda's inability to secure their supplies, and even goes as far as to say that she should have used some of her own money to get the supplies they needed, and that she was only as useful to him as the contents of her pockets, and that her ability as a healer was not good enough to even heal scratches. Upon seeing us, it seems that our reputation precedes us, and he seems oddly competitive as he claims that the job venturing into Sastasha should have been his from the start. From these short interactions, we can see how Avir is probably not the nicest man, and that he seems rather selfish and only in it for the glory and pay, and it seems that Edda's party as a whole lacks any form of unity. After completing both Sastasha and the Tomterra Deepcroft, we can go back to the Carline Canopy and report back to Mother Miyune, and it is at this time that we meet Edda and her group and overhear their argument. Avir is not present, and we soon learn why. It seems that throughout their venture into the Tomterra Deepcroft, Avir was slain. The group argues about whom the fault of Avir's death should fall to. Both Leavin and Pyoreo place their blame on Edda, and while Edda does seem to accept a lot of blame and guilt herself, she also points out how Avir had ran out of range of her spells and that the rest of the party should have done more as a whole to help ease Avir's burden. Pyoreo and Leavin leave Edda alone, and Leavin makes mention that Edda should stop carrying around Avir's head. Edda is abandoned and is left alone with her guilt. Upon journeying to Danalan and dealing with the threat inside the Copperville mines, we go to report to Mamadi, and we find that Edda has come to speak with us personally. She explains the story we had already overheard back at the Carline Canopy, and we also learn more about Avir. It seems that Avir had been Edda's fiancé, and that he had been greatly admiring the Warrior of Light and aspired to be like them. This adds a bit more character to Avir, however it does not seem to excuse how we had seen him treat Edda earlier. However, Edda never makes any mention of how badly Avir nor the rest of her party had treated her. In fact, she is quick to admit that she is a poor example of an adventurer herself. She had even considered giving up on adventuring for good, but is instead inspired by us like Avir had once before and decides to return to her village to begin her training again. She only requests our name, and upon learning it, hopes that we meet again and bids farewell. And so, it should be the end of a rather bittersweet tale of a woman who had a tragic experience and managed to glean some sort of wisdom and inspiration to better herself to make a new future. But Edda's tale does not end there, and we would meet her again. Nearly a year later, we find ourselves a new reason to return to the Tomterra Deepcroft, where Avir had lost his life. In Oldal, we can find Pyoreo, whom wishes to consult us about a troubling matter. It seems that he has received an invitation to Edda's wedding, but there are some details that concern him. Edda claims that her groom-to-be is still Avir and that their wedding is to be held in the Tomterra Deepcroft. Not only that, but Leavin has already seemingly agreed to attend, and Pyoreo wishes to speak with her, but has no way of contacting her as she has joined the Scions of the Seventh Dawn. Being the Scion's champion, he asks if we know where she is, but we recall that she was slain during the Imperial raid led by Livia on the Waking Sands quite some time ago. We agree to accompany Pyoreo to see Leavin's grave, but we find it desecrated and her body missing. Pyoreo is quite upset by this, and at this point we see how Pyoreo has grown a bit since Avir's death. He admits that he and Leavin had been heartless and how he knew that Avir's death had been on everyone, but that he and Leavin had instead placed all of the blame on Edda before leaving her alone. Pyoreo seems to find some resolve, and he declares that he is to journey back into the Tomterra Deepcroft to hopefully bring Edda back to her senses and requests our aid in the matter. We agree, but by the time we travel to Tomterra, we learn that Pyoreo had already entered before us with the women dressed in white. We follow after him and fight various Voisin along the way. Throughout the dungeon, you can find notes written by Edda chronicled sometime after Avir's death. The first note talks of how she finally managed to speak with us, and she seems to be mentoring Avir as she speaks of someone whom she refers to as my love, of whom she had told us all about. The following note speaks of how she had returned to her village as she had promised long ago, but she had begun to feel like it had been a mistake. She then decides to begin adventuring again with Avir. The next note details of a journey to Mordona, and it is now clear that something is definitely wrong, as not only is Edda speaking with Avir, but she seems to be convinced that Avir is speaking back to her. Not much further in, we run into a reanimated Liavin. We defeat her and discover more notes. It seems that Edda is attempting to find a new body for Avir, a strong body to match one of her own. She explains that a strong body requires a strong soul, and whilst those may be rare, combining smaller souls together can achieve the same goal, and we now realize that some of the enemies we've been fighting throughout the Deepcroft have been used by Edda in some sort of ritual to restore Avir's body. We come across Fyuria soon, and after manage to free him. Unable to take the horrors of the dungeon, he leaves Edda to us and cowardly runs toward the exit. We move deeper into the Deepcroft and finally encounter Edda herself, along with Avir's ghostly head. We manage to defeat Avir and find that Edda is completely broken and unstable. From the beginning, we can see how Avir and the rest of the party had mistreated her, yet she still seemed to strive to serve them. As Fyuria had explained it earlier, adventuring had been her life. Then she had lost Avir, her fiancé, and what seemed to be her chance at love, despite how he seems to mistreat her. And then next, she was left with the guilt over his death and was abandoned by the rest of her party. Grief and despair likely pushed her to madness, and she began to experiment and use darker magics to possibly restore her lost fiancé. She even brought back Liavin and invited Fyuria to attend her wedding. It would have been a joyous reunion, but one orchestrated by Edda's madness. Having lost Avir a second time before her eyes, and also slain by the one that both she and Avir had admired so much, Edda cannot contain her grief and falls presumably to her death. This is also one of the few times where we do not celebrate a victory at the end of a dungeon. We exit Tom Terra and report back to Fyuria, who considers giving up his time as an adventurer, mirroring a similar sentiment we had heard before from Edda so long ago. But before he can finish his thoughts, he sees a ghostly version of Edda and flees in terror. We turn to look, but we do not see anything. Edda's story would not continue for some time, however. It seemed that she would haunt the city-states, as there were very few rare moments where her ghostly self would appear briefly to lucky, or perhaps unlucky adventurers, depending on how you would look at it. After our return to the Tom Terra Deepcroft, it would be another 2 years before we would finally gain some closure with Edda's story. While journeying into the depths of the Palace of the Dead, a figure dressed in black could be seen observing us. As we dived deeper and deeper into the Palace of the Dead, it would later be revealed to us as Edda, now dressed in black instead of white, wearing an eye patch and wielding a scythe with a mini version of Avir clinging to her shoulder. On the 50th floor, we finally confront Edda Blackbosom and fight her head on this time. We manage to defeat her and her body dissipates, and left is her original soul, dressed in white, and we meet Edda Pureheart once again. She seems to be fairly confused, but happy to see us nonetheless. She smiles and tells us how she has finally started anew as an adventurer, and how she wishes Avir could see her. She doesn't seem to be aware that she has already died. She recalls a foggy memory of falling, likely the fall she had had in our last encounter in the Tom Terra Deepcroft, as well as a robed figure. She disappears after this, leaving behind a ring which we pick up, and we seem to mourn over Edda in our own way once again. Upon further exploration into the depths of the Palace of the Dead, we encounter Nybeth Obdalord, a necromancer looking to find his way to cheat death. We learned that it was him who had brought back Edda as one of his experiments with reanimating the dead. We defeat him and leave the Palace of the Dead. Upon leaving the depths of the palace, we are given information of a familiar Lalafell with whom we are acquainted with. In Buscaron's Druthers, we find Fyuria again, who has been haunted by thoughts of Edda and has spent his days restless and drowned in drink. We show him the ring we had retrieved from the palace, which he recognizes as Edda's engagement ring. He enlists our help once again, and we travel to a nearby river where he explains that one night Avir and him had been drinking, and whilst drunk, Avir had tumbled into the river and had lost his engagement ring. In contrast, he tells stories of how Edda would always place her engagement ring in her breast pocket for fear of it becoming dirty on their adventures. Once again, we can see how much this engagement had meant to Edda, but Avir's own feelings on the matter are still fairly questionable in my eyes, as he was careless enough to lose his own engagement ring, and not only that, kept its loss a secret from his fiancée. We manage to find Avir's ring and travel to Lenosha with Pyoreo, where he sets up a memorial of sorts with Edda and Avir's engagement rings, hoping to finally put their spirits to rest. Once the small ceremony is complete, Pyoreo feels a weight has lifted off of his shoulders, and he thanks us for all that we have done for him. And I rather like this scene. Throughout our time together, we've seen that Pyoreo has acted rather selfishly and cowardly a lot of the time, but we also see that he does feel regret and notices his own weakness and how that had contributed to Avir's death, and furthermore into the madness Edda had suffered thereafter. He is the sole survivor of Edda's party, and it's nice to see that he has grown a little from these experiences, and that having seen how Edda has suffered, Pyoreo has seemingly gained a new resolve to see to it that other adventurers do not suffer a similar fate of his old comrade. Pyoreo departs, and as we turn to leave ourselves, we hear a disembodied voice say thank you. We turn back and admire the view that Edda and her party had partaken in so long ago, and we know we have finally put Edda's spirit to rest. And that is the end of the tragic story of Edda Pureheart. I'm not especially knowledgeable of all the lore there is in game, so I hope that I haven't glossed over that many important details, but I hope you enjoyed this video all the same. Edda's story is likely one you've experienced already in the past, but I do think it's important to look at some of the smaller details as well as the supporting characters within the story. I myself do think that Edda's story is really sad and tragic, and I can sympathize greatly with her even though she does succumb to madness. When it comes to the supporting characters, I personally do question Avir's character and wonder how, if he had survived, what kind of toxic relationship he would have had if he had been able to wed Edda. Edda surely deserved a better man, but I can only say this with the very limited interactions and details we know of Avir. The few bits of dialogue we hear him speak to Edda alone make me not want to trust him at all, and we can tell how much Edda is in love with him despite all of this. So our own descriptions of him make him sound like he's just an adventurer who aspires for more than he was really ready for. I don't know, maybe it's just something that is lost in translation, but I don't really think that Avir was a very good person. Of course, no one really deserves to die and then be reanimated as a creature born of one's madness, but still I find myself unable to feel that bad about Avir and just feel more sympathy for Edda in the long run. Pyoreo, on the other hand, I think has grown a lot from his experiences, and while he does act very cowardly and selfish throughout the story, I do think that by the time Edda's spirit is laid to rest, he has become a much better person. With Edda's story closed, it's unlikely we'll see Pyoreo again, but I did grow to like him as Edda's story progressed. And that is my retelling and my thoughts on the story surrounding Edda Pureheart. Thank you for watching all the way to the end, and feel free to leave your own thoughts on Edda's story in the comments below. It is a very tragic and somewhat creepy tale, and it is still one of my favorite stories within Final Fantasy XIV, even with the additions of so many new tales being added to the game as the years progress. If you enjoyed the video, a like is always appreciated. This is my first time really making a video like this, but I do have plenty of other Final Fantasy XIV content with much more to come, so if you're new, feel free to subscribe if that sounds interesting to you. And I guess I'll see you guys in another video. Thank you all for watching. Sayonara. Bye bye.